and our paths probably crossed here in Ellensburg. And we were talking earlier, I probably met you in, I don't know, 84 in Ace Records. And I was that kid buying the Clash records, but you remember me, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Welcome to the Exploring Washington State podcast. Here's your host, Scott Cowan.
All right, Mark, I've hit the button. We're live. Thank you for allowing me to meet you here in Ellensburg. And so we're recording live in a recording studio on my equipment, so no offense to the recording studio. Mark, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Hello out there. I'm Mark Pickerel, Ellensburg, Washington resident since 1968.
Did you have that T-shirt?
Working on one.
Working on.
Yeah.
So, Mark, your name's come up in multiple conversations with guests, both past and future of our show. And I'm aware of you because of one particular band. And our paths probably crossed here in Ellensburg. And we were talking earlier, I probably met you in, I don't know, 84 in Ace Records. And I was that kid buying the Clash records, but you remember me, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to just jump in and ask a very, very direct question. Your first band that I'm aware of was Screaming Trees.
Mm-hmm.
Was that your first band?
It was, although the Screaming Trees were born out of Him and Those Guys. There was a band that preceded the Screaming Trees just by a couple of years that didn't feature Mark Lanigan on vocals, called Him and Those Guys. And, you know, we
I remember that name.
Do you really?
I do. So that's what's, I'm like, looking at you going, oh my gosh, I remember that name. Okay. So, all right. So you started here in Ellensburg, we'll just say with Screaming Trees. How long had you been playing drums at the time you joined the band?
Let's see. I started playing drums in sixth grade.
Okay.
And it was my freshman year that I met Van and Lee Connor, the guitarist and bassist of the Screaming Trees. And we discovered our mutual fascination for, you know, everything from 60s psychedelia to the second British invasion of groups like The Clash and Echo and the Bunnymen and
okay,
Susie and the Banshees, Wire, and bands like that. Psychedelic Furs. Anyway, we formed a band like within a week of meeting, and played for a couple of years under the name Him and Those Guys. And then Van Connor met Mark Lanigan in a journalism class, and Mark had just acquired a drum set through a drug deal gone bad, and basically a guy couldn't pay up, and so he gave Mark a drum set in lieu of cash payment. So Mark had just started playing drums, and our band Him and Those Guys had kind of hit a wall with what we were trying to do, and you know, we knew it was time for us to expand our repertoire beyond just playing covers. And so he asked if he could join our band, but wanted to play drums. So I moved to the microphone for our first rehearsal, but it was so obvious that he didn't know what he was doing behind the drums and even though I could carry a tune as a singer, I hadn't really developed any kind of special quality or character as a vocalist. So we switched roles, and right away we could hear that, you know, that he possessed a quality and a personality as a vocalist that was mature beyond his years and his experience.
So how old were you at this time?
I would have been probably a sophomore in high school.
Okay.
So, I don't know, 17 or something like that.
So that would have put...
We might add, Scott, that we're doing the interview right here in the very recording studio that we recorded our first record at. We recorded Other Worlds right where I'm sitting in 1985.
So where, in relationship to where I'm at, where was the drum kit?
The drum kit for our first session, I think, was right where my drums are sitting as we speak. This is now a rehearsal space for me, and my drums are actually just sitting a few feet from where I'm sitting with Scott. And that's where I was set up for our first session. And then I think the next couple records I was set up right behind you.
So help me out here, because you guys were young kids. You're in Ellensburg,
Right.
which is not a hotbed of musical activity at that time. I mean, other than the Ranch Tavern.
Yeah,
which,
other than a lot of really incredible, mostly cover bands passing through. And occasionally, as you might remember, even artists like J.J. Cale played at the Ranch, and John Lee Hooker played the Ranch. And every once in a while,
yes,
we'd get lucky with someone's routing and get to host a world class.
To make fun of Ellensburg a little bit, but I saw Ted Nugent at Central, and I saw Sammy Hagar at Central. In fact, I was Sammy Hagar's bus bellboy at the Holiday Inn. Huey Lewis has played at Central. We won't talk about that show.
Scott, we'll have to come back to this subject, because I ran away from home because my dad wouldn't let me go to that Ted Nugent or to the Sammy Hagar concert, and so I ran away from home. I originally was just I had snuck out to go to the concert. My parents found out that I snuck out, and so I found out through a friend that they were looking for me. So when I found out that I wasn't going to be able to go to the concert because my dad was waiting at the concert door, I actually literally ran away from home for the next 3 days so I could go see Sammy Hagar and Zebra in Spokane.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but that I know where we're getting.
This is awesome.
Yeah, I forget what we were supposed to be talking about.
Well, I was making kind of fun of Ellensburg of being a musical hotbed, and we just off the rails we go.
Yeah.
But you guys are young kids. You're in a recording studio in Ellensburg. How long did it take you to record that first album?
Okay, so I'll back up a little bit. It's kind of an interesting story. So I worked at this record store right down the street called Ace Records. And there was a 7-inch single there by a group called Anonymous. And I noticed that I listened to it, and it was really unusual. And I asked the store owner, Tim Nelson, about it. And because I noticed that the address to write to the group was an Olympia address. And I'd hardly ever stumbled across any interesting records that were from the Northwest. And this one was especially interesting because it wasn't your straight up like post-punk garage rock or pub rock that a lot of the bands out of Seattle were playing, like the Heats and the Young Fresh Fellows, groups like that. This was avant-garde and really unusual and had more in common with like Brian Eno, David Byrne collaborations, like a lot of like tape loops and unusual stuff like that. So I asked the owner about this record called Anonymous. He goes, "Oh, that's Steve Fisk's project. Steve Fisk used to go to Central." So I decided on a whim to just write a fan letter because I was so intrigued with the idea that someone from this area and Ellensburg specifically had produced a record that didn't have anything in common with the terrain or it wasn't reminiscent of anything else I was hearing out of the Northwest. Anyway, Steve wrote me back and told me about this friend of his, Sam Albright, who was just about done finishing building this recording studio, and that I should stop by and say hi or whatever. And anyway, I didn't, but a few months later, Steve was asked to move back to Ellensburg to be the house engineer and producer here. And so he found me. So Steve moved back to Ellensburg a few months later and found me working at the Connors video store. The Connor brothers and the whole family owned this video store by then called New World Video.
Wow.
Yeah. And so Steve walked in and introduced himself. And that happened to coincide with Gary Lee Connor having just finished some home demos that were really quite sophisticated. And we were trying to decide how as sophisticated as they were still demos. And we knew that we needed to actually get into a studio and bring a new dimension to them. So I gave Steve these demos we'd recorded, and then he approached me a few days later and said, "Hey, these are really great. You guys should book some time with us, and let's let's roll tape. So we, within a couple weeks, we were right in this room recording Other Worlds. I was, like I said, I was a junior in high school, and the rest is history. So that's how it all got started.
Wow.
Yeah.
This could go in so many different directions. I mean, it just could. Because now I want to ask you, do you remember Frazzini's Pizza?
Well, yeah, I can one up you because David Frazzini, John's son, was my replacement when I quit him and those guys for a little while, and the band turned into the Explosive Generation for about 6 months, and then they dissolved, and then that's when the lineup with Mark Lanigan and
oh my gosh.
I kind of all got into a room to
See, I warned you that this will go. Yeah, I warned you. So
all kinds of sideways here.
Oh my
But
gosh.
yeah, Frazzini's was a home away from home for all of us because not only did we love the pizza, but there was video games and pool tables and all that. Yeah.
I'm sure we ran across each other there too. Because in fact,
and David and I still keep in touch. But anyway.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay. So Screaming Trees. I don't know what else should we say about your time in that band? I mean, what was it like? I guess I'll ask you this question. What was it like being a young kid?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the way I see it as being part of an explosive wave, a genre that just exploded. Yeah, what was it like being in the middle of that hurricane?
Sure. Well, it was really exciting, but I'll say that, we felt like outsiders living on the east side of the Cascade Curtain, and it seemed like, obviously Seattle was the cultural center of Washington State, but Steve, who produced that first recording of ours, was friends with a guy named Calvin Johnson, who had a record label in Olympia called K Records. Well, Calvin used to live in Ellensburg, so there was that connection there. And Steve thought we should send our cassette to Calvin to see if he would be interested in distributing it, because K Records was also they also did distribution. So Calvin loved our cassette and asked us if we'd like to come to Olympia and open for this band called the Wipers, who they were out of Portland but had this huge international following. And so it was midway through my senior year, we got to go play this really great show in Olympia, and people just loved us, totally embraced what we were doing. And that was our first indication that what we were doing would be accepted on the other side of the mountains. And from there on, it just really snowballed. And then it was, Calvin introducing us to Bruce Pavitt, who ran and operated Sub Pop. And Bruce started coming out to our shows and asked us if we'd like to contribute to the first Sub Pop compilation. And so it was just all these little incremental, like big baby steps. And yeah, it became more and more exciting with each day, with each,
So how did you get through school? I mean, because here you are playing shows. I mean,
just barely.
Yeah.
By the time I got midway through my senior year, I really wanted to just drop out. But my parents were like, "You've got to be kidding! You've come this far. There has to be a plan for you to get through your senior year." And so somehow, I don't know who I convinced to help me make that a reality, but I'm sure that there were a few friends, and I know of at least one girlfriend that made it so. I won't lie.
Well, I can't imagine. I mean, thinking about myself in high school, I can't imagine. I mean, I didn't pay it. Mom, you're not listening, are you? I mean, I got good grades in high school, but it wasn't my priority. And I wasn't playing shows. I wasn't going to, I grew up in Tacoma. So it wasn't like I was coming over to Spokane to play. Here you are, you got Sub Pop Records talking to you. You've got, I mean, surreal.
It was very surreal. And when we signed our first contract with SST Records right after my senior year, and at that time, SST was considered probably the most happening record label in the world. They had, I mean, let me read you a list of just some of the highlights from their roster: Black Flag, Sonic Youth, Dinosaur Jr., the Meat Puppets, the Minutemen, Husker Du, Dinosaur Jr., all these bands were on SST. And when the Screaming Trees went to see Black Flag during my senior year when they were playing in Seattle, we knew that Black Flag's guitarist Greg Ginn was also the owner of this incredible record label. So we brought the demo tape that we made right where we're sitting, and I put it right next to his next to his monitor. And he picked it up and put it on his amp. I forgot all about it, but that was the first seed we planted with that label. And within a couple of years, we were part of the roster. But that was probably the most exciting day of my life in music was getting to join that roster.
Did he listen to the tape?
Absolutely.
So he didn't just like pick it up and like get it out of his way. He picked it up, and at some point he listened to you.
Yeah. And there's actually a second part of the story that I failed to mention, was that Steve Fisk, who produced those first recordings of ours, had a friend named Ray Farrell who'd gone to work for SST. And Steve sent our record Clairvoyance, which we had just finished, to Ray, not really even in hopes of us getting signed to SST, but he knew that Ray might be able to help us find some shows down in LA, which he did. And but Ray played our record for Greg, and Greg pointed out to Ray that he'd already been listening to us ever since I dropped off this cassette with him when we came to check out Black Flag. So, you start planting seeds as early as you can, and you never know when, something's going to grow out of it.
That's really, really cool.
Yeah, I was really
really
outgoing.
Cool.
I was sort of the spokesperson for our band early on, and the one out there shaking hands and consigning our cassettes at record stores in Seattle, and
how were cassette sales in Seattle? I mean, because earlier on you said you weren't sure because you guys are isolated in Ellensburg. I'm putting words in your mouth with that word isolated, but here you are in Ellensburg, Cascade Curtain, as you called it. You play a show in Olympia. You got good response. So you're like, okay, this will play well in Peoria. So how when you were consigning cassettes, how was it?
Yeah, I don't know where I developed the audacity to just walk into record stores, but we would drive to Seattle and go hit the Ave, University District, because there was about 8 or 10 record stores within 6 blocks of each other back then, maybe within 3 blocks of each other. And I would walk in with a few cassettes and maybe I don't remember if we had like a little press kit of reviews or anything like that. It also helped that we immediately landed a radio show. Before Clairvoyance even came out, we ended up being guests on KCMU's Audio Oasis, which was their local show. And Jonathan Poneman was the host, and Jonathan became Bruce's partner at Sub Pop. So here's how all these worlds connect, is somehow probably Bruce or Calvin Johnson mentioned to Jonathan that we'd be a good guest for his radio show. And so that gave us a little extra street cred. So when you walked into a record store, you could say, hey, my name is Mark Pickerel. I'm the drummer in this band called the Screaming Trees. We're going to be guests on KCMU's Audio Oasis next week, and we're looking for places that might be willing to stock our cassette and this and that. And, and so we just, as Too Short would say, you get in where you fit in. You just figure out different ways to secure some kind of relationship with a store, or leave a good impression wherever you can, and that's what we did. People always say in the music industry, it's not what you know, it's who you know, but more importantly, it's whether or not you leave a good impression. Right. And we were really dedicated to that, to making as many friends as we could, and to nurturing as many little relationships as we could, and I think that really served us well over the years. In fact, the whole industry is based on relationships, as you can probably attest to in the current field that you work in. And
Well, that and having the audacity to pick up the phone and call somebody and have a conversation, even if the conversation's like, no, thank you.
Right.
You'd be surprised. Most of the conversations have been, I'd like to do that. I'm really very pleased. And at this, I think I figured out the best pickup line of 2021 is, do you want to be on a podcast? It just works. Anyway, we could talk about the Screaming Trees, and I don't think I could do that chapter of your life justice. So I'm going to ask you one last question about the trees, and we'll move on. When you remember the trees, was there a memorable show for you that you thought was just like, wow, this is cool?
There was a couple.
Okay.
One was opening for Sonic Youth at, I want to say it was the King Street station.
Oh.
I forget. There's two stations right there in Pioneer Square. One's a functioning train station, and the other one, at least at the time, I don't think was. But anyway, I think it was a King Street station opening for Sonic Youth was a really big deal. And also we shared bills with Soundgarden, and we played their first record release party at the Tractor Tavern, which was really incredible. Wow. And then we played their the first date of their right after they signed with A&M, their first major label release was Louder Than Love, and we played like the launch date of that record release party and the launch of that tour with them at the Moore Theater around 1989, I think. That was an incredible night. That was
okay.
Tad, Screaming Trees, Soundgarden. Incredible night.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I literally could go on and on.
No,
but you're right. Let's.
But I do want to ask one other question about that era. Uh-huh. You played drums with Nirvana.
Uh-huh. I should add, when I played with Kurt and Chris of Nirvana, we were operating under the name The Jury rather than Nirvana. Those recordings ended up coming out on a Nirvana record, and so people oftentimes mistakenly introduce me as a member of Nirvana, which, I'm happy to, if it opens up doors that normally wouldn't be available to me.
You're all for it.
Except I do, when in an environment like this, I feel like I should set the record straight for my own credibility.
Right. So the reason I'm asking this question is, you mentioned you guys went over to Olympia.
Yeah.
And what little I really know of Kurt Cobain was, Aberdeen, and they played in Olympia a lot. How did you meet Kurt and Chris?
We saw them perform right down the street at a community center here in Ellensburg called Hal Home Center, and they were incredible. I don't think that I met them that night, but they left an incredible impression with all of us. And then we had heard that they signed with Sub Pop, and then friends of ours mentioned to us that they were huge Screaming Trees fans. And in fact, I remember when the Screaming Trees opened up for Sonic Youth in Portland around 87, that Kurt and Chris came out to see the show and ended up hanging out with us backstage. And they may have mentioned at that point that they were big fans of our records. And in fact, Kurt actually wrote us a fan letter at some point that appears in some book.
Okay.
So he was a fan of ours, and we were fans of theirs, and just ended up in the same rooms, same shows over and over again. And so, yeah.
And so you guys got together, recorded a few songs kind of as a project.
Right.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's very cool. All right. So I'm going to grind these gears, and let's fast forward to now. Because I was listening to some of your Mark Pickerel and Praying Hands. I could not get the Peyote 3 on Spotify. I could not find it on there.
Good to know. It may, that may be my own fault that I submitted that recording a little bit late for it to meet the deadline, most likely. I would imagine that like any day now, and by the time
this is live, it'll be. Yeah.
I think that it'll be available through Spotify by then.
And I have this, I don't know how I want to describe this to you, but so when I think of you, I think of you as this, because I was watching the video, I Nearly Lost You. and I was laughing because it was recorded in Ellensburg, and I never noticed that before.
Uh-huh.
I'm like, wait a second, this is Ellensburg. I just, anyway. Yeah. But I think of you in that genre of music.
Yeah.
And so I'm listening to you play more contemporary stuff now. And we're much older than we were back then.
Mm-hmm.
But here you are, and I'm butchering your history, but I think of you as a drummer, and here you are now, front of the band, singing, playing guitar.
Mm-hmm.
What inspired that evolution?
Well, it's actually kind of a sad story. A few things in my career had sort of stalled or hit a wall, or really tragedy struck in the. So a few months before Kurt died, Kurt asked me to play drums on what would have been the follow-up to In Utero. So I was going to actually play drums on Nirvana's, on one of what would have been Nirvana's next record. Kurt died, and my affiliation or association with Mark Lanigan had stalled, partly because of the choices he was making at that time in his career. And I thought that I was going to continue playing on Mark's solo records long after I'd quit the Screaming Trees. Well, Mark became less and less prolific during that period. And I was just having a hard time staying busy as a musician, as a drummer. And it was pretty evident to me that if I was going to be as productive and as prolific as I wanted to be, it was going to mean having to set out into a different direction and, learn how to write and learn how to try and convey some of the ideas that I'd had inside me for many years. But I never really had a strong desire to be a front man or to really even be the creative force within or behind a band. But because I just wasn't staying as active as I wanted to as a musician, I recognized that it was time for me to pursue some other a different direction and a different course for my life. And so I bought an acoustic guitar and started writing. It was around probably around 93.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm not a music critic, and I don't want to read anybody else's reviews because they'll put words into my head. But when I was listening to some of the songs that you have, melancholy, maybe
that works. Yeah.
Okay, and but not morose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But subdued and
I think of it as mood music. So melancholy is
okay.
I would say it would be a good.
But your voice, long pause here, folks. Your voice, there was elements of it that just made me think of, and this is going to maybe be funny to you, but Johnny Cash.
Mm-hmm.
And
I get that a lot. And
do
it is
you?
funny
Okay,
because
I hadn't written it because I'm trying to come up with my own words to express this.
Yeah.
But it was this.
It's funny because growing up here, I had a strong aversion to country music.
Okay.
And here's some irony for you. We lived on Radio Road, on the same, like about probably 40 yards from the KXLE radio tower, and KXLE is like Ellensburg's country music radio station. But in the 1970s and in the 80s, country music had really taken a turn for the worse for the most part. And country music was really something that I associated with or affiliated with, like, guys in trucks slowing down and, rolling down their windows and throwing beer bottles at us. Like, country music was the soundtrack to us being, assaulted with beer bottles. And so I grew up with a really negative affiliation with it. And I'm also not exaggerating when I say that when we picked up because we were so close to the radio tower, when we picked up the telephone to make a phone call from our house, you could hear like Take This Job and Shove It or Dolly Parton's 9 to 5, like coming from the phone. So,
I don't care what you heard coming through your phone. You would have hated it.
Yeah,
you would have
probably,
hated. You would have hated Screaming Trees if you would have heard it pick up the phone.
And here's another funny thing. Just like in the movie Groundhog Day, back then KXLE's broadcast in the early morning was totally canned, and so oftentimes you would hear the same song. So when my alarm went off in the morning, oftentimes you'd hear the exact same song at the same time for days on end. I'm pretty sure that's really the way it was, and not just the way I remember it. But anyway, it wasn't until years later that I even developed any kind of positive association with country music. But eventually, apparently I did. And the first couple records I did as a solo artist, I was really self-conscious of my voice because I could hear this kind of country element in there. And so I really tried to do whatever I could to disguise that by using a lot of synthesizers and just doing whatever I could to offset my discomfort with the fact that I sounded like Willie Nelson and Johnny Cash. But eventually I had to just accept who I am as a singer. And now I'm a huge fan of that genre, and especially that period from like the, 50s and 60s, a little bit of the 70s. I still don't really like that period where country kind of transitioned into like using like aspects of disco and but yeah, so I'll take the Johnny Cash as a compliment. The Johnny
and yeah, it was. I was listening to it and I go, there's just this. It evoked this memory of Cash,
Sure.
and I'm not a huge Johnny Cash fan. I mean, it just there was this. So, Mark Pickerel and his Praying Hands. Mm-hmm. How did you come up with that name?
Well, it's funny. So I just, like you mentioned earlier, I now we're calling the band Pickerel and the Peyote 3. And part of it was because I wanted to sort of shed this image that I had kind of adopted, this wolf in sheep's clothing, like this preacher man with a secret kind of, image or whatever. Because I just, I used to sort of be fascinated with those kind of characters that you often read about and see in old Western films. The snake oil salesman or the preacher who's, really a villain underneath. But more and more, you see those kind of people still operating out there in the world, and there's nothing attractive about it in reality. And I just decided I kind of wanted to move on and not be, I just didn't want to do anything else under that moniker from now on, even though the general public probably had no idea that was even something that I was pretending to.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
No.
It just became a personal thing. I just decided like I want to start operating under a different name, and also when you do that, when you start using different images and names, album titles, artwork, all that stuff, it helps inspire new creativity, and so that it's just time. But actually, I also want to say that the name originally just came from it really just came out of one time seeing the Praying Hands tattoo, the classic Praying Hands tattoo on the shoulder of like this really buff, strong guy, and I thought it was powerful that such a masculine guy would wear a Praying Hands tattoo on his arm. And I thought that really showed a lot, really revealed a humble aspect of this person's character that I was really attracted to. But then it kind of, next thing I knew, I was playing on all that imagery and also sort of taking on this like preacher man kind of image that I just decided I wanted to abandon.
So is the Peyote 3 a band, or is it revolving musicians?
Yeah, it's kind of a collaborative.
Okay.
If it could be a permanent band, I would love that. But the guys that I play with are in such high demand and so busy with multiple projects that I can never seem to. I can't remember the last time I played more than 2 or 3 shows in a row with the same lineup. And I used to really kind of resent that and wish that I could just bring the same band out night after night. But now there's kind of this collective of guys Johnny Sangster, Jeff Fielder, Ian Moore, all incredibly talented guitarists who are in such high demand. I mean, Johnny plays with Nico Case. Jeff Fielder plays with the Indigo Girls and Mark Lanigan. Ian Moore is a headlining. He's a headliner and has shared the stage with everyone from Bob Dylan to the Rolling Stones. And anyway,
so nobodies.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, these guys are in really high demand, and because I don't get the tour as often as I'd like to, there's just not enough money to keep these guys. I can't keep them on the payroll.
Right.
So now it's just this collaborative or this collective that I call the Peyote 3, but it really represents about maybe like 8 or 10 different people.
So are you recording all the parts? Or are they recording them? Walk me through a recording process now today.
Yeah. So I write the songs on my acoustic guitar, and oftentimes I have maybe drum parts in mind and guitar parts in mind, melodies, themes, things like that, production ideas. But I typically present every song to as many as 2 to 4 musicians. Usually we're rehearsing for a show, and I'll pitch a couple of new songs during a rehearsal and see if we can fit one of them into a show. And anyway, so we start developing the songs in traditional band rehearsals, and then we'll take a song to the studio. Sometimes I'll end up playing the drums on my own songs, depending on who's available on a particular day to record. Like Mike Musburger, who's played drums on like 4 of my releases now. Like literally the last time I booked studio time, he had to leave the session early for a gig with Carrie Ockery, and so his drums, but he left the studio kit at the session and used a different set for the show. And studio time is expensive, so I just I asked Mike if it was cool with him if I go ahead and just play drums on my own song, and he had no problem with it. He gets it. And so really we kind of just improvise as we go along and figure out who's going to play what, and sometimes we switch roles.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're a very interesting person, and I want to talk about things that are not music related, and I know I'm shortchanging music. But I'm going to ask you 2 questions about music in general. I've already asked you the questions. Now I'm going to spin them a little differently. When you go see music play, when you go see performers in Washington State, can you name a venue or 2 that you think is an outstanding place to see music performed?
Sure. I'll start with the Gorge, even though it's kind of
it's your backyard.
Yeah, it's in the backyard. I mean, it just has so much to offer. Even if you don't enjoy the music you're hearing, which is pretty unlikely, you're going to have scenery that you're not going to see anywhere else in the world. It's beautiful. Usually the production is incredible. The sound is usually incredible.
Who have you seen at the Gorge? A memorable show for you at the Gorge?
I'll start with saying that I was there for one of the very first concerts, or it might have been like, maybe a couple of years into their operation. I saw Bob Dylan and Tracy Chapman there. And that was back when you'd walk in and everyone was allowed to buy 2 bottles of wine, and you just go sit out on you bring your own blanket and
that was great.
Yeah, it was incredible. But some other incredible shows, The Who, REM, Radiohead, David Bowie, Depeche Mode. I've seen and performed at least a couple of Lollapaloozas there.
Oh, wow.
And sharing the stage with, it's pretty cool. After I quit the Screaming Trees, I joined a band called Truly, and we got booked to play the side stage at Lollapalooza a couple of years in a row, sharing the stage with a few bands before they were even household names like Primus and Tool. But yeah, so and then also, I owned a record store here in Ellensburg for several years called Rodeo Records. And because of our close proximity to the gorge, we were asked to be the Lollapalooza record retailer back in the 90s. So for like 2 or 3 years in a row, we were the ones stocking all of the artists' CDs and merch, and we did like on-site autograph signings under our umbrella and everything. Really, really exciting period.
Okay.
Hosting like, live signings from everybody from Nick Cave to L7 to the Beastie Boys, and selling records to Beck, and like, so we brought used records out there as well. And so oftentimes before the show started, any artist that showed up earlier in the day would come and record shop from us. And like I said, Beck came and bought a bunch of records, and Cypress Hill and Coolio and Nick Cave. It was really fun. So anyway, that's one of my top venues. Other smaller clubs that I love to play or to see music at would be the Showbox. Would be probably number one.
Which Showbox?
Seattle downtown.
The
Showbox.
only one that matters. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I actually don't mind seeing shows at Sodos Showbox, but it's not as special as seeing shows at the Showbox. And I also love playing the Showbox. I've played there as a drummer probably 8 or 10 times. I was the drummer there for Nico Case. I've played with the Screaming Trees there.
Wow.
I've done a lot of shows with like members of Pearl Jam and Guns N' Roses there under the collaborating with this lady named Deborah Heesh, who works for STG. She oftentimes puts on these really incredible fundraisers for different organizations and causes, and she'll bring together members of all these Seattle artists, and we'll raise money for an event. Anyway, I love seeing shows and playing at the Tractor. But yeah, I could go on and on.
It's funny because I ask that question all the time.
Yeah.
The Tractor's probably with the current guest list. I think the Tractor's coming in probably at number 1.
Yeah, that's really cool.
The Gorge gets mentioned, but not as much as you might think.
Yeah.
But the Tractor, and the Triple Door. The Triple Door is another venue that people
love playing the Triple Door.
But I love the Tractor. I don't know why, but there's something about it's not a great. It's an awkward room,
right? Like if you walked in there at noon to do janitorial work or whatever, you wouldn't think to yourself like, "Man, this would be a great place to see a band."
No.
Or there isn't really anything especially attractive about it.
But somehow you put a band on stage.
You get people in there. And yeah. And it's funny. I used to play there so much. I was the drummer in the Dusty 45s for a while, and we were regulars there. I was in the Souvenirs for a while, and then started putting out my own solo records. There was a period there in the early 2000s that I would play there sometimes like 3 times a week, and in a different lineup, or headlining one night, playing drums the next night, sitting in with a band who needed a drummer, maybe playing a tribute night a few days later, just singing one song during like a Townes Van Zandt tribute night or something like that. So there'd be times when I would just get to leave my drums there for 3 days in a row.
Okay.
Yeah, it was pretty incredible.
Can you think of a venue in Washington that you haven't played that you'd like to play? And I don't know that there's an answer to that. I'm just curious.
The Kingdom?
The Kingdom. Okay. Yeah. Good luck with that. Did you ever see a band in the Kingdom?
I never did. I never got to. Not a good place to see a band, apparently.
Did you ever see a band in the Tacoma Dome?
I've seen lots of bands in the Tacoma Dome.
And it's not a...
Yeah, it's not my favorite place to
but
to
it makes
see.
It's...
But I've had a couple of memorable experiences there, or like when I was still in high school, I was lucky enough to see Deep Purple do their Perfect Strangers show at the Tacoma Dome, and that was a very meaningful and incredible evening of music. It was they brought Ian Gillan back to the band, and they performed like all the Highway Star and Smoke on the Water, and just it was amazing. Saw Robert Plant there. Saw the first Kiss reunion tour there, or the Makeup reunion tour.
And they're on what version of the reunion tour now? Their last tour, volume 12?
This was pretty exciting for me because I didn't get to see them with makeup the first time around. So this was in my early 20s when they reformed with Peter and Ace. And so anyway.
Yeah, but the Kingdom was not a good venue. I don't think the Tacoma Dome's a great venue.
No.
And it's awesome compared to what I remember the Kingdom. All right. Now, we're done with the music chapter of your life. Okay. We're closing it for this episode. Well, that's not true because you sell records. You've got a really cool store in the Thorpe Fruit and
Antique Mall. Yeah.
Fruit and Antique Mall. How did you get involved? Because you got a lot of vintage vinyl. You got some old vintage clothing that's well curated. How did you get here?
Yeah.
Not to sound like a Talking Heads record.
So what Scott's referring to is I have this space that I refer to as Road Trip Records, and we exist under the umbrella of Thorpe Fruit and Antique Mall, which is located about 100 miles east of Seattle, right off I-90 exit 101. I started selling primarily vintage vinyl out of there about 7 years ago. Well, back in right after I left the Screaming Trees around 91, I opened up my own record store here in Ellensburg called Rodeo Records, and we operated for about 13 years. When we first started, I started with like $1,000 small business loan. That's as much money as I had to spend on new product. And so I was looking for different ways to increase our inventory and add something unique to our inventory that our competitor Ace Records didn't offer. And I had a really good friend who lived in Spokane named Jack Kendall, who I still see all the time. And he had a vintage clothing shop called Rick's Classic Rags over there. And he left Rick's Classic Rags and was kind of doing his own thing. And I asked him if we could consign vintage clothes at Rodeo Records. And that was kind of my first introduction or affiliation with that, that side hustle was just, and anyway, it's been a long time fascination of mine is vintage vinyl and vintage clothes. They both, they seem to work really well together and plus you can find them in the same places. So when I'm out hunting for vintage records, it's, oftentimes I'm at an estate sale where I'm also going to come across a vintage wardrobe. And so, yeah, it's just one of many things that fascinates me.
Well, your collection in Thorpe is really interesting. And we share I shared with you before that I used to work for an industry that similar thing on a different scale, but similar. Is it still fun looking for stuff? I mean, is it still make you smile?
Fun. It's so fun that you could. So I actually did a podcast called Dream Path Podcast with a friend named Brian out of Yakima just a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about how he was accused recently of participating in what's called like productive distraction or constructive distraction or something like that. And it's when you, in an attempt to avoid the thing that you really want to do the most, in my case, that might be like making music and recording records, you find yourself engaged in all this other busy work that's really fun and fascinating and cathartic, but maybe it's preventing you from doing the thing that you really should be focusing your attention on. And that's what I'm guilty of with records and vintage clothes and antiquing and junking and thrifting. And I mean, I could go days without doing anything else and be happy just sourcing vintage stuff. Like that's just like how I would like to spend all of my days, all of the time. And I have to actually remind myself to take time out of all of that to work on lyrics to a new song or to promote my new record, things like that. And, somebody asked me recently, a friend of mine, who's also from Wenatchee, he pointed out, he was asking me, give me a second here and we'll edit this. The Comet. Okay. I have a friend that has this publication called The Comet out of Wenatchee. And he was asking me for an interview I did with them recently and his name is Ron Evans. He was asking me recently, if I was more interested in, or he was asking me to kind of explain how I transition or segue from my retail business into my retail business, and how, and I was reminding him or informing him that to me, the two worlds inform each other all the time, and they're to me, they're in concert with each other all the time. And I'm learning things from this world that I'm so preoccupied with, where I'm outsourcing all this old stuff, but I'm learning from all. I'm like really like digging through history, and I'm unearthing all of these stories about our past here in Washington State, and I do a lot of soul searching as I'm looking through all these, what I consider artifacts of Western civilization here in the Northwest. And a lot of my songs reflect that, or a lot of that is reflected in my songs. And so I don't really look at it as two different worlds that are compartmentalized. I find myself kind of swimming back and forth between the two things. And not to mention, I'm handling records all day long, and I see a lot of the same records by different bands, or different titles by one band spanning like a 10 or 20 year career. And you sort of see where bands made mistakes, or where they maybe tried to cross over from being like an album oriented band into being pop stars. And you see like different mistakes that they may have made along the way. And you start to, ask yourself questions about your own career and where you've made the same mistakes, or make sure to view this as a cautionary tale and don't do what this band did. And, I'm constantly, yeah.
Do you, when you're specifically with vinyl or CDs, because those are vintage now too, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you spend much time listening? Like, so you go to an estate sale and there's a large cache of records, and you just probably pick them all up, and then you sort through them and you go, got 37 of this one, and
right.
And that, ooh, here's something. And do you take the time to listen?
Yeah. So I'm just going to jump right in here. I recently just bought a record collection out of Kittitas, which is just 10 miles east of Ellensburg. And it was just like a hop, skip, and a jump from where I grew up. And this guy had acquired his dad's record collection. His dad grew up in LA in the 1950s and 60s, and was just an avid fan and record buyer. Anyway, he'd acquired thousands of records. I acquired this collection of his dad's, consisting of all these 7-inch singles by artists like Etta James and Buddy Guy and Howlin' Wolf, and just incredible. But Scott, what I wanted to say is that not only do I listen to a lot of those records, but going back to this idea that I'm informed by that process, I'll give you an extra glimpse into how it sometimes influences me. Is I'm really fascinated by 7-inch singles, and just the idea of, just that for many years, that's how people enjoyed music. And oftentimes when and you study the graphics and the cool label, and sometimes there's a cool picture sleeve or whatever. And oftentimes when I'm working on my own songs, I'll ask myself, is this song would it have been worthy of producing a 7-inch single during, in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s? Like, does this song have what it takes to warrant that kind of format? And usually the answer is no. In fact, 90% of the time the answer is no. And then you have to start asking yourself why. Like, well, why doesn't this song possess the same qualities as a good 7-inch single? Why doesn't it deserve its own format? Why doesn't it deserve a picture sleeve? And then you start kind of like, you really examine the song and go, okay, well, for one thing, it's a 5-minute song. And so then you're in a position where you can ask yourself, does it need to be 5 minutes long? And maybe there's some justification for it being a 5-minute song. Let's not forget that Stairway to Heaven was a half an hour long. Just kidding. But I mean, occasionally there's justification for a song exceeding the 3.5 minute, 7-inch single mark or whatever. But oftentimes there's not a good justification for that. And then you start examining, whether or not there's just too many verses and whether or not you need to be going back to the bridge a second or third time within the same song. And okay, let's cut 2 of the bridges out. Let's cut the solo section in half. Anyway, so yes, that world to me has become an essential part of my creative process. So when I go to work as a retailer in the morning, oftentimes I'm collecting thoughts throughout the day and notes to myself throughout that process that I apply later on to my songwriting and creative journey.
Well,
is that the longest answer?
No, because the thing is that I completely can see how they would help both. Mm-hmm. I know that if I were, going through a record collection I just purchased, and I'm sure, Zeppelin 4, you've got literally, you probably throw it away because there's how many thousands of copies have you obtained through the years, right? But if you were to find a 7-inch single from, say, Etta James, you're like, I haven't heard this before. I would stop and I would listen to it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know whether I'll appreciate it, like it, mm-hmm. or if it's going to change my world. You don't know.
But it's certainly worth 3 minutes of your time. Yeah.
And you wouldn't have been exposed to it without doing your retail gig.
Yeah.
So exactly. I see it as being a complementary but yet integral component of
integral is the word I was trying to find earlier, so thank you. And yeah,
they're very much, I don't want to say left and right brain, but they're independent. Yeah. But there's this overlay where they come in. I see it.
Also, I've always been fascinated by retail, and so curating and presenting that product back to the universe is really important to me. I like to do it as artistically as possible. And I don't really know where that fascination came from, but just from the time I was really young, I was just really intrigued with retail environments. And so, I apply that to what I'm doing. And in fact, my bandmates always tease me because I always show up at every gig 2 hours early to really present our merch in the most sophisticated way that I possibly can. And oftentimes it's all for naught, because by the time another band shows up with their merch, and then by the time, next thing I know, somebody's saying, hey, you can't set that up over there. That's where our, bus station is going to, that's where we're going to have this alternate bar tonight where we're going to serve, Bud Light and
Bud Light.
So can you take that down? And, I take it all way too seriously, but yeah. Also, all these things are related in my mind.
And I vintage stuff resonates with me. Uh-huh. I look backwards far more than I look forwards. I look back on historical events far more than I worry about or even think about optimistically the future. So I'm wired that direction. Question. It involves your life. So you grew up here in Ellensburg. Mm-hmm. You formed a band. You got to see a bunch of the world playing stage. At least you got to see hotel rooms and stages in parts of the United States and the world. Why'd you come back? Why is Ellensburg home for you?
Well, it's kind of complicated. First, I'll just say this. I do love living here. I love the terrain. I love waking up to the smell of sage and lavender, and it's it's a beautiful place to live. The view of the Cascades, you just can't beat it. The canyon drive from Cle Elum to Yakima is one of the most intriguing works of art I've ever been exposed to, and has fueled many lyrics. I probably released 10 or 15 songs that I've written between Ellensburg and Yakima and back. Just
Really?
from that drive, it just inspires so much creativity for me. But I have made a couple of attempts to live in Seattle, and I love Seattle. Basically, I just got priced out of any neighborhood that I would want to live in over there. And I'll say that, I would be happy living in the south of France. I love New York City. I would love to live in a penthouse apartment in New York City. I love Austin, Texas. I love Tucson, Arizona. I love San Francisco. I used to think that I'd live in LA someday, and I still wish I could. But it's practical for me to live here. I know everybody. It's affordable. I'm an hour and a half from the city where all my bandmates live. There just isn't a feasible, practical reason for me to live somewhere else. So I don't want to pretend that I only live here because it's the only place I want to live. I do love it, and I find it very inspiring, and I feel like I'm as happy here as I would be in any of the places that I just described.
Okay.
And I have been to London, I've been to France, I've been to Italy, and I want to go back. I can't wait to go back. But I'm also really happy here, and I also find Washington State to be really unique, both in terms of its geography and everything it has to offer, and its people. So yeah. But sometimes you have to just accept that, the planets line up, and you kind of,
I don't normally ask questions framed negatively, but I'm going to ask a negatively framed question. If you could get whatever you wanted, what is the one thing that Ellensburg's missing that you wish it had? For you, for Mark Pickerel, if Ellensburg had, you can snap your fingers and it's there. So what's it missing that Austin or New York or LA might,
Yeah. And thankfully I see this, I see our dining options expanding, which is very important to me. I'm lucky that there are like 2 or 3 restaurants in Ellensburg that really appeal to me and my family. Sugar Thai, our Thai restaurant, is world class. We eat at a restaurant called C5 all the time.
Okay.
And we eat at Ellensburg Pasta Company a lot. Anyway, there's a few restaurants here in town that I really like. We ate at the Tav this week, and they still make the Super Mother Burger the same way they did 30 years ago, and the Barney Burger the same way they did 40 years ago. So anyway, I get by with what Ellensburg has to offer in the way of cuisine, but I'm anxious and always looking forward to the expansion in that world. In general, I find that most of my needs here are being met. We could use a good music venue. While we're on that subject, we haven't had a good live music venue operating here since the one you mentioned earlier that burned down in the 80s called the Ranch Tavern. We've had a couple places that bands can play and that occasionally do play, but we haven't had like a functioning music venue here for as long as I've been, since I turned 21. So that would be really cool if somebody could make that. So I am really proud of our art gallery, Gallery One. They have become an incredible force for the good of the greater good here in Ellensburg. Their Friday art walks are as impressive as any that I've been to around the world, and their commitment to their outreach is really impressive. They have programs for kids. They have programs for adults. They have these just really well curated exhibits. It's very thoughtful. It's very professional. It's world class.
Okay. Yeah, I don't normally ask a negative question, but I'll be honest with you. I'll answer my own question.
Please do.
With Wenatchee, I love Wenatchee also, but it's the cuisine.
Yeah.
I wish we had.
Yeah.
And now with the pandemic, it was hard for anybody.
Yeah.
We'll give everybody a pass, but
yeah.
I just wish there was some different cuisine.
All of Central Washington kind of suffers from that.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that's sort of changed that has been the introduction of all the craft breweries and wineries that have appeared, that are kind of scattered throughout Central Washington and Eastern Washington. And that has raised the level of quality of options for cuisine, because if you're going to have if you want to be taken seriously as a grower or host tastings, you want to have the cuisine that matches that, like that, that complements that. So I think that has really raised the level out here, like from Walla Walla to, especially from Yakima to Walla Walla. There, a lot of restaurants, I think, probably were born out of, different caterers that were working full time for different wineries out there. Saw an opportunity, and a lot of restaurants, I think, have come out of that. So
I hope some of them come to Wenatchee. I mean, I do.
Yeah, I get it.
So when you're not doing your retail and you're not doing your music, what do you and the family like to do for entertain? What do the kids like to do? I mean,
well, I walk to the Yakima River from our house about 3 times a week. I walk our dog around People's Pond.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It's really great. Ellensburg has a new park called Rotary Park. It's kind of an extension of West Ellensburg Park right here off of 3rd Street. So just like 3 blocks from where Scott and I are sitting right now. And so and they've made this trail that basically a block from our house is the beginning of this trail that goes that takes you underneath I-90 and over to Cary Lake, and then there's a path along the Yakima River right there that I can go on walks to and stuff. But yeah, we go swim in the Columbia River sometimes out at Vantage. We spend a lot of time at the park, a lot of river walks. And
do your kids like to go to Seattle with you? Does the family go to Seattle?
My 13-year-old has been bugging me about when are we going to go to Seattle next, and she loves going to the market. She loves hanging out. I used to work at Easy Street Records in West Seattle.
Oh, okay.
And there's a bakery down the street that she is really anxious to visit. And
which one?
I'm.
Oh no, sorry, I put you on the spot.
It's a block south of. Forgive me, I can't think of the name of this European French bakery.
Okay.
About a block and a half south of Easy Street Records on California Avenue. It's just a few doors down from the Husky Deli, which she also loves. But yeah, there's a lot. We used to spend a ton of time on Alki because I lived in West Seattle, and so love Alki Beach and love hanging out at Easy Street Records still, and having breakfast there. And
did you ever play at Easy Street?
Absolutely. In fact, I had my record release party for Tess. We put a record out called Tess about 7 years ago, and our record release party was at Easy Street. I also was lucky enough to, about 6 years ago, the Sonics reformed, and I got to play drums for the Sonics, one of my all-time favorite bands, and that was at Easy Street. So that was a really,
so there's a
day.
video out of the Sonics playing there.
Yeah.
And I don't recall you playing drums.
I'm playing drums on The Witch. So I think it was the very last song. Okay. And I was lucky to get that song because Matt Cameron from Soundgarden was signed up to play on that song. And so when I was asked what song would I want to play on by this the Sonics, the first song that came to my mind was "The Witch." It has this really classic, iconic drum intro and drum break throughout the song, and it's like total garage punk rock song. Anyway, but Matt was already signed up for that, and I'm not really in a position to ask Matt Cameron to forfeit. But he had to cancel. So at the a day before the show, I was told that, in fact, I could play on The Witch if I wanted to. So I had to really scramble to make sure I really had it memorized. That there's a couple of complicated little twists and turns in that song that are easy to get mixed up. Anyway, but I think I nailed it. It was such a great night. Eddie Vedder sang that night. Members of the Presidents.
Yep.
Played. Calvin from Beat Happening sang. Van Conner from the Screaming Trees came up and played a song. Yeah, it was a great night.
So I watched that video.
Yeah.
And admittedly, here I am talking to musicians in Washington State, and I grew up in Tacoma, and I didn't know that much about the Sonics. So here was my takeaway of that video. How old were those guys at that time?
They're in their like 80s.
I've never
70, like mid 70s to early.
I've
80s.
never seen a drummer so violently attack a drum kit.
Okay, so that isn't their original drummer.
Okay, but that man, whoever he is,
yeah, he's great. He came out of a band called Agent Orange. Yeah, he's an incredible drummer. Yeah,
but I've never seen. The whole time I was watching, I just was obsessed with watching this drummer.
Yeah, he's
and
incredible.
I don't normally. I'm not like saying I watch drummers all the time, but it was like
he's the perfect man for that job, and he really propelled. And I think it was helpful to them to have a guy who could really drive the bus. Who really like. Yeah.
Well, I want to wrap this up so we can get you going, and it's the time we're recording this is it's probably 105, 110 degrees today.
Right.
It's a balmy 100 and something.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a coffee nut. Are you a coffee fan?
I love coffee.
Recommendations?
D&M. Got to go to D&M. And if you're not a D&M person, they do serve Cafe Vita coffee out of at Vinman's Bakery, which is, we were talking about cuisine earlier.
Right.
I think we have one of the best bakeries in the world right here in Ellensburg, Washington. It's called Vinman's. Yeah. It's adjacent to the campus. It's right off University.
It's where where Fresenius
used to be. Look up Vinman's if you're in Ellensburg.
Okay.
Yeah, just incredible. In fact, it's now owned by a guy I went to high school with.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. So to wrap this up, you've got some new songs out, right?
I do. Yeah. Yeah.
I think, I don't know if we were recording when I said this. At the time that we were recording this, I couldn't find them on Spotify. So they'll be out by the time that this is live.
If you look up Mark Pickerel and his Praying Hands just about anywhere, you can find. I released 2 records that kind of complement each other within the last 6 months. The first one is called Rebel in the Rear View, and it consists of about 10 years worth of recordings. And features all of the cover versions of different songs that we performed over the years as a band. Well, those same sessions, we recorded originals, and all the originals are on the new Pickerel and the Peyote 3 record entitled "I Have Visions."
Okay,
and anyway, so yeah, during COVID, I really needed to figure out how to make the best use of my time. And so I decided to dig out all these abandoned recordings that I've been doing for the last 10 years and see if I could extract enough songs to release a record. Well, it turned out I had 22 songs that really just needed some mixing and maybe a couple of overdubs and chorus harmonies and things like that. So we've Johnny Sangster, my guitarist, who's also a celebrated producer, went in and did all the work to bring these recordings back to life for me. And it turned out we had about 11 covers and about 11 originals. So I decided to market them separately. And so you've got
Okay.
Two releases that really represent, or that consist of the same recordings. Just anyway.
Okay. And so where else can people find you if they want to find you?
Amazon, Spotify, Bandcamp is my preferred place to send people because Bandcamp offers a really generous royalty rate to artists. So if you want to contribute to the cause, the best thing to do is to go to Bandcamp, and don't go to just the Mark Pickerel page, but go to the Mark Pickerel and his Praying Hands page where you'll find my last 4 releases.
Okay.
And but otherwise, Apple Music, YouTube. There's a YouTube channel now. So really, it's just basically a Google search away. You can find any of this.
Google Mark Pickerel, and we will find you.
I really decided to go ahead and make the music available like on basically every legitimate platform, even though some of them aren't as generous to the artists as others. It's really important to me that people hear the music because I want to get out there and start touring again. And the only way for me to,
any tour on the horizon?
There's not a tour on the horizon, but I do have 2 dates coming up. I'm playing Slim's, which is a really cool little roadhouse south of downtown on First Avenue. It's called...
in Seattle.
Yeah, thank you. Slim's in Seattle on August 7th and Slim's on September 10th.
Okay.
And I'm actually also, I think I just got a text from my friend Trey out in Walla Walla, who has a winery out there called Sleight of Hand. And I'm going to play his, watch for dates coming up. I'm going to play his room and also in Soto at the Sleight of Hand's cellar, a tasting room coming up. We haven't confirmed the date yet, but by the time this airs, if you just look up, or go to my Facebook page and I'll announce a date.
Okay.
Just go to Mark Pickerel on Facebook, and that's the best place to follow me and Twitter.
Oh, you're on Twitter too?
Twitter. So
okay.
I'll always announce dates.
We
on
all
Twitter
have different platforms of choice.
Yeah, I know.
It's so funny.
Yeah.
All right.
I know we could spend an hour just listing all the places you can find me.
Google search is kind of the ubiquitous place. Yeah. Well, thank you for making this happen.
Thank you, Scott.
I had a lot of fun.
Me too.
And I am looking forward to seeing you play live here shortly because you're playing at some venues that I like to go to.
Yeah.
And if you find any of those albums I talked about before, let me know. Anyway, thanks so much for being on.
Thank you.
Join us next time for another episode of the Exploring Washington State podcast.